So, saving democracy, that's a pretty heavy lift. It's not one I imagined I'd ever even have to think about. But here we are in 2018. And when you think about what that means, at its basic sense, you could say it's preserving the rule of law. It's ensuring people have the right to vote. But I think democracy has a more fundamental basis. Democracy entails, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, the art of compromise. And in order to compromise, we have to be able to talk to one another, no matter how different we may be in our perspective. Now, in a time when all of the headlines suggest we have lost that ability, the chasms between us are too wide, you could subscribe to that and conclude democracy is now broken. Tonight I want to tell you about a project we did at the Reading Terminal Market, where I work every day, that I believe set a template to prove otherwise, that it is possible to still preserve those fundamental tenets of democracy. So the Reading Terminal Market, you all know it. It's a wonderful place to come, shop, and eat, spend time with your families. But in the early 1990s, when the decision was made to save the market from the demolition block, it was recreated with a broad charter, a social mission, of course to be a place for fresh food, but also to become the melting pot of Philadelphia. The mission statement explicitly provides it is intended to be a place that embraces the diversity of our city and fosters interaction amongst those diverse residents. You could argue it's been successful in that mission. In fact, it's been so successful that in 2012, a sociologist by the name of Elijah Anderson wrote a chapter about the Reading Terminal, and he coined a nickname for it in a book that he wrote called The Cosmopolitan Canopy, because he observed a place where everyday strangers across race, across ethnicity, across income lines, geography, whatever barrier you want to imagine, were coming together and interacting in a way that he hadn't seen in other public spaces. So in 2015, as the newly minted general manager of the Reading Terminal, I had two goals. One was to simply execute our organization's mission. But two, amidst a city that is diversifying at a pace that we haven't seen in nearly 100 years, driven by immigrants from all over the world, Asia, Latin America, Africa, I wanted to make sure that the newest Philadelphians feel a connection to the Reading Terminal in a way that generations of Philadelphians have done, and that they see it as their public space, whether they spend every day there or just one day a year. It is their market just as much as anyone else's. And knowing about Dr. Anderson's research and observations, the power of food to act as one of our last remaining common denominators, I wanted to see if we could bring our city one step closer. So to that end, with the support of the Knight Foundation and our project partners, the University of Pennsylvania's Project for Civic Engagement, hello Linda, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and the City of Philadelphia's Human Relations Commission, we launched a project called Breaking Bread, Breaking Barriers. The premise of this project was simple. Working with our project partners, we identified immigrant communities across the city who either did not know one another, didn't know the neighbors they were residing next to, or had some measure of conflict with each other. And we asked them to come to the market to engage in a shared cuisine exchange whereby they would learn to cook one another's cuisine. Because let's be honest, our cuisines are far more than just the basic ingredients that are included in them. They represent our values, our history, our stories. They represent our cultures almost better than anything else I can think of. Now, these were not ordinary cooking demonstrations where you learn it's a tablespoon of this and a cup of that and you baste the meat for 45 minutes. No, these demonstrations where they were cooking one another's cuisine were intended to communicate those stories and what was important to one another's communities, so that they walked out of that demonstration and then sat down and had dinner together, with the dinner dialogue facilitated by the Human Relations Commission with the intention that they have fundamental understanding of one another's communities. And then each of these pairings were asked to come back to the market. At that point, they had to decide outside of our four walls what recipes they thought were important to one another and what did they want to share with their new friends. So over the course of 18 months, we brought together communities as diverse as Korean Americans and African Americans living around the 52nd Street corridor. We brought together West African refugees and their neighbors in Southwest Philadelphia, Cambodian Americans and residents of South Philadelphia, the Mummers, Chinese, and Mexican communities for one dinner. And in what proved to be one of the more impactful pairings, see, this project was planned in 2016. After November of 2016, its relevance and its importance rose to another level. And so the most powerful evening that we had in the course of this project was the night we invited the newest Philadelphians, Syrian refugees, men and women who had fled years of war and trauma, living in refugee camps, living in whatever country would bring them in, ultimately finding their way to the United States. We invited them to come dine with their new neighbors, residents of Northeast Philadelphia, just to get to know them. Now, it just so happened that that dinner took place on an early February night, 2017, 2 days after Donald Trump announced the first iteration of the Muslim travel ban. So you have these men and women with children in tow, not knowing if they will ever see their parents, their siblings, their aunts, their uncles, maybe other children that have been left behind. There is an incredible sense of emotion that night. So the project concluded with all of the groups that we invited coming to Filbert Street. It's the main public street in front of the market for one long communal dinner. Over 200 people representing 12 different communities, 12 different cuisines. Philadelphia at its best. Now, I can't say that at the end of the project we saved democracy, but I do know the night that West African refugees and their African American neighbors concluded that they have tremendous commonalities in the way that their cuisines evolved, though an ocean apart. I think we added a block back to our democracy. The night that the Mummers invited myself and my two brown-skinned children, named Leela and Renjith, to be amongst the marshals of this year's parade. I think we added a block back to our democracy. And back to that night with the Syrian refugees. When the guests entered the room that night, there was an elderly woman. She came in. She was reserved. Frankly, she looked a little sad. And as she sat for the dinner, she was quiet the entire evening. I'm wrapping up. This is the climax. At the end of the night, she stands up. Really hadn't said a word the entire dinner. And with the help of an interpreter, she says, "I thought this evening was just going to be about food. It turns out it was about unity." I think we added a block back to our democracy. And just as a prologue, if I can, don't ring the bell. One of the women that attended that dinner from the Syrian community came to us a few days later. She was desperately in need of a job. Her husband is now blind in one eye. The building that they lived in Aleppo was hit by an explosion, and he's unable to work. She needed work in America. And so we put her to work on our maintenance team. That's the only thing we could offer. Well, 6-7 months go by, and she's working very, very hard, incredible work ethic. And I go to her and I say, "Look, I can give you a full-time job doing this. You'll have health care, you'll have paid vacation, you'll have a 401k. And she said, "I don't want that. What I really want is I want to open my own business here. What do I need to do to make something at my house and sell it here at the Reading Terminal Market?" I said, "Well, you can't really do that. You have to make something in a license-approved kitchen, so on and so forth." Well, long story short, through through the help of 3 other nonprofits, the Welcoming Center for New Pennsylvanians, the Enterprise Center in West Philadelphia, and the Women's Opportunity Resource Center, Amina opened her stand at the Reading Terminal Market this past Thursday afternoon, Amina's Foods, where she's selling hummus, rice pudding, and her traditional Syrian pickled vegetables. That, my friend, is what makes America great. That is saving democracy.